How far back can we trace the English language? Let's take a person like me, for example. I'm a native Utahn speaking a subdialect of English belonging to the Great Basin, or the Mormon Corridor, in the larger dialect region of the western United States. The primary difference between Great Basin English and the rest of North America is the pro-do predicate construction, otherwise known as the pro-predicate do. This dialect feature indicates a much more recent British influence than the rest of the United States due to Mormon pioneer immigrants from England and Wales traveling westward between 1850 and 1910. The English that those pioneers spoke was a version of present-day English, which was once Middle English, a blend of Old English and Norman French. Before Middle English came Old English, which was itself a syncretic mix of the languages of the Angles, Jutes, and Saxons. Histories from the period tell the story of Vortigern, king of a Celtic tribe called the Britons, who traded English land in 449 CE to two Angles named Hengist and Horsa if they would help him fight some pesky Picts. He made a purchase pact pertaining principally to pack up the pesky Picts. The subgroup of languages that these northern German tribes spoke is called Ingvaeonic, after the Roman name for the regional tribal group, the Ingvaeones. From here, the taxonomy starts to get a little blurry. Ingvaeonic, also known simply as West Germanic, refers to a regional evolution of Germanic divided into three groups: East, West, and North. These languages evolved out of a hypothetical language referred to as Proto-Germanic, spoken sometime in and around 500 BC in Northern Europe and southern Scandinavia. So, where did these people come from? What we do know is that Neolithic cultures inhabited this area as early as 6000 BCE, during which time the Scandinavian peninsula was notably warmer than it is today. Well, wait, that's impossible since the Earth is only 6,000 years old. These people evolved into the funnel beaker culture, followed by a regional Bronze Age and then finally an Iron Age before the arrival of the Romans in the 1st century CE. Germanic belongs to the language family known as Indo-European, to which, according to the Summer Institute of Linguistics, 446 living languages belong, including the Romance languages, Hindustani and Persian. So how did a group of people living in the northern European plain, without migrating for over 6,000 years, come to share a language family with people all the way in Iran and even India? The answer lies in a hypothetical people speaking a hypothetical language called the Proto-Indo-Europeans. These are the theorized common linguistic ancestors of the Indo-European languages, who probably migrated broadly between 4000 and 1000 BCE. At some point, these theorized people came into contact with the Proto-Germanic tribes and their languages and cultures intermingled. The idea of a Proto-Indo-European language is normally attributed to an English scholar named William Jones. Jones was a judge and a bad poet, who, alongside Benjamin Franklin, tried and failed to negotiate an end to the American Revolution in 1780. In 1786, Jones proposed a hypothetical common linguistic ancestor after he noticed similarities between Sanskrit and Classical Greek and Latin. Jones, however, was not the first to notice these similarities, with theories dating back to the 16th century by European missionaries and merchants traveling between continents. In 1653, a Dutch scholar named Marcus Zwaurius van Boxhorn proposed a similar common language ancestor, which he called Scythian, in reference to the ancient steppe kingdom that dominated the Pontic-Caspian steppe in the 9th century BCE. The term Indo-European was first used by Thomas Young in 1813, and Ferdinand de Saussure's laryngeal theory, published in 1879, marks the true beginning of modern Indo-European studies. So where did these Proto-Indo-Europeans truly come from? What group of people spoke this language and where do they live? There is no true academic consensus, but we can say with relative confidence that they came from here. Not very helpful. There are several major theories which have tried to narrow this answer down to a more specific region. The most widely accepted theory is the Kurgan hypothesis, also known as the steppe hypothesis. First proposed by a group of German scholars in the late 19th century, the Kurgan hypothesis was methodically brought to bear in 1956 by Lithuanian anthropologist Marija Gimbutas. This hypothesis agrees with Boxhorn that the Proto-Indo-Europeans came from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, what is now the modern-day battleground between Russia and Ukraine. The Kurgan culture is so named for the Russian word for burial mound. This hypothesis relies on two main points of evidence. First, archaeological sites in the area strongly suggest that the hypothetical Kurgans domesticated the horse sometime during the 5th millennium BCE. This evidence matches with the reconstructions of Proto-Indo-European vocabulary, which includes terms like axle, yoke, and wheel, which suggest a relatively mobile or nomadic culture. The Kurgan hypothesis holds that the domestication of the horse facilitated migrations out of the steppe westward into Europe, southward into the Anatolian Peninsula, and southeast into West Asia and the Indian subcontinent, anywhere but north. In 2007, anthropologist David Anthony argued that the invention of the chariot in and around Europe can probably be explained by a steppe migration such as this. The Kurgan hypothesis holds that the Proto-Indo-Europeans and the Proto-Germans would have collided somewhere around 2500 BCE as part of the corded ware culture and evolved the languages that would, after more than 4,000 years, eventually give us our beloved present-day English. The second point of evidence for the Kurgan hypothesis, and perhaps the most persuasive, are the several studies published over the last two decades that have provided strong genetic support for both the steppe as the Proto-Indo-European origin point and as a migration out of the steppe and into adjoining regions. The most famous competing theory to the Kurgan hypothesis is known as the Anatolian hypothesis, first proposed by archaeologist Colin Renfrew in 1987. Renfrew argued that the emergence of a Proto-Indo-European language is likely to have corresponded with the development of farming in Mesopotamia, which began as early as 10,000 BCE. Statistical models seem to demonstrate that the Proto-Indo-European may have begun to split into its daughter Indo-European languages as early as 7,800 to 9,800 years ago, a much earlier timeline than the Kurgan hypothesis would allow for, supporting the argument that language developed in conjunction with stationary farming cultures in the Anatolian Peninsula. Several descending studies have also cast with the Anatolian hypothesis, most notably a language velocity field estimation published in 2024, which relies on spatial dispersion models of language rather than genetic ones, and seems to support an Anatolian origin point. This study is a much more attractive explanation for those scholars who have criticized the genetic evidence of the Kurgan hypothesis as forgetting that language is transmitted socially, not genetically. Renfrew has modified his position since he initially proposed the Anatolian hypothesis, instead arguing that the Proto-Indo-Europeans originated somewhere in the Balkans. Other theories do exist, some of which attempt to reconcile the two hypotheses, others of which propose Proto-Indo-European origin points in places like the northern Ural Mountains near the Arctic edge or the Indian subcontinent. But these are largely held as unsubstantiated. So what's the point? Why do we care where English came from or what people spoke 10,000 years ago? Well, first of all, it's interesting and cool, so be curious. When Proto-Indo-European was being spoken, there were between 5 and 10 million people on the planet. That's somewhere around the size of New York City. For every 1,000 people alive today, there was only one person alive during the Proto-Indo-European period. For more reasons than we can possibly grasp, life was so much more different than it is today. Secondly, and most importantly, understanding the truth about our linguistic, genetic, and cultural ancestors has dramatic cultural, political, and even legal ramifications. If you are a white person in America, every time you check a box on a form that says Caucasian, you're participating in a centuries-old misunderstanding of the origin of white races. The whole Nazi cultural project was founded on a pseudo-archaeology that claimed Aryans were genetically and historically the race, a more pure, more original than other corrupted races. White nationalism in the United States subscribes to a fundamentally ahistorical and unscientific conception of race that relies on a version of the Proto-Indo-Europeans that does not exist. Even less radical forms of nationalism rely on tribal ideas of race and culture that draw on our linguistic and cultural origin stories and ignore our largely common ancestry.